Om yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakurotam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi stuve Patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam katra sutrasya bhashyasya kramat vivaranasya cha. Those who join this series of classes later and not listen to the exposition, the explanation of these invocations, you can always ask me to repeat, to explain this invocation verses again. I'll be happy to do that. So now I think we already got an idea of the components, the different aspects, the different elements of what we call avidya. So avidya is sometimes translated in the earlier translations into the English expression is called the unconscious or the consciousness undifferentiated sometimes. That's how they translate it during the early years of the introduction of Yoga Sutra into English, especially the Harvard oriented series and many similar earlier publications before the Second World War translated this word avidya into something like undifferentiated consciousness or consciousness undifferentiated. So what it really implies has to be properly understood. So what is avidya? The technical translation, the simple translation is ignorance. And in with Swami Vivekananda's translation or exposition, you find he has used the same word. But as you proceed further, Swamiji identifies the Purusha, the reality of Purusha as Atman. That's how Swamiji equates. So you find in Vivekananda's exposition of Yoga Sutras a more holistic approach. Because otherwise, Yoga Sutra only helps us to understand the workings of the human mind. Especially, it gives a very clear idea, even if you're a total non-believer. If you don't believe in anything other than the body-mind complex, if you are just a layman who is not at all interested in anything transcendental, Yoga Sutra will give you a correct understanding of what our true personality is. You don't have to be a spiritual aspirant to understand that from Yoga Sutras. But it also takes you to the next stage of your spiritual cultural evolution. That is, what happens when people die? Is everything gone? That big question is haunting philosophers and thinkers and religious teachers for thousands of years. And Yoga Sutra tells us that what goes into flames or what goes into the tube in the crematorium is only one tiny, insignificant aspect of our true personality. Our true personality is expressed in the way we think, we act, we speak, we feel, and we respond to different situations from the external world and also from different feelings and emotions that we feel within ourselves. So Yoga Sutra reveals to you a different world of our true personality. Something remains when the body comes to an end. So in the coming sutras, you are most probably are going to be shocked when the yoga exponents tell you what our body truly is. There are shocking expressions, shocking to those who spend a lot of money in beauty parlors, in buying clothes, in spending money for changing the face, blackening the hair and whitening the teeth, you'll be terribly frustrated and shocked when Patanjali tells you the real truth. But there is also a source of comfort and consolation. And he says, this is the nature of this body. But there is something much higher, much subtler, a much more profound aspect to your true personality. That is the world of samskaras, vrittis, sankalpas, in Sanskrit, let us say, the emotions and feelings, the impressions that we inherit when we are born again. So the idea that we are going to be born again, life doesn't begin with being born in a hospital bed and being burnt out or disappearing into a tube in the crematorium. That is only a very minor and very insignificant part of our existence. But death is only a comma or a semicolon. It's not a full stop. So that's what we are going to discuss in today's classes. The very profound, very important sutras, the 4th and 5th. I deliberately postponed discussion of this subject. So I gave you an idea of raga, dvesha and abhinivesha, these 3 kleshas, just to make our mind ready for understanding the true meaning of what avidya is. So in the 4th sutra, avidya itself is defined as the genesis, the cradle, the fertilizing ground, the womb of all kleshas. So kleshas are also a very interesting word. You find again the translation is often hindrances in the Harvard Oriental series. Now, those great scholars have done an absolutely magnificent work, a wonderful contribution towards this important task of introducing the great Oriental spiritual cultural ideas to the West. It is tremendous work that the Harvard Oriental series did. But kleshas are not hindrances, as we understand by that particular word in English language. What are kleshas? Kleshas are emotions and feelings, and more than that, tendencies, what we call samskaras in Sanskrit, which are already there deposited in our mental system, which will find expression not only in this life but in future life. And these tendencies can never really die, but they can be handled. You can weaken those tendencies. You can make them so subtle that they do not disturb you. Just like, suppose you got a grain, let's say one kind of food, grains. You cannot destroy it, but you can fry it with oil in the kitchen. And you put in a very fertile soil, it won't sprout, it won't become a plant, it won't fertilize. Or you can burn it, you can fry it, so you can practically make it ineffective, but you cannot destroy them. On one occasion, some devotees asked Sri Ramakrishna. In fact, it was one of our own great monastic disciples, not Swami Vivekananda or Swami Brahmananda. Another, in fact, it was Swami Turiyanandaji, the great monk who came to San Francisco and who actually inaugurated this great holy task of introducing Vedanta to California. So Turiyanandaji asked Sri Ramakrishna, his guru, so how to deal with these disturbing thought currents that emerge in the mental system? How can they destroy them? As Sri Ramakrishna's reply was, you cannot destroy them. But you can certainly handle them. You can turn them into something creative and constructive. Then they become as good as completely subdued, or as they become completely neutralized. So you can find here the fourth sutra is this one, that is the avidya kshetram uttaresham prasupta thanu vichunno dharanam. This is the sutra. Now many of these Sanskrit constructions need some kind of a rearrangement to make it easy for us to understand the meaning. It's called putting in prose order. That's called, padacheda. I mean splitting words and putting them in the logical prose order of the meaning. So if you do that, it means avidya. What is avidya? So what is avidya? Avidya is our natural state in which we are not fully aware of what we actually are, what our true identity is. That is the most psychological way of putting it as far as I can think of. So, but then in simple word we can say ignorance of our true personality, ignorance of our true identity. So when we are not aware, or when we are not knowledgeable about our true identity, we mistake ourselves to be many other things that we actually are not. So in the technical language of Yoga Sutra, we identify ourselves with whatever we experience outside, because we have not understood what we really are. We have not understood that we are Purusha, we are the consciousness, we are the Atman. So we identify ourselves with many things going on around us, and so we become happy, unhappy, etc. That will be explained when we discuss Asmita, which comes later. So here, avidya prasupta thanu vichinna udaranam. This is the... So, avidya, what is avidya? Avidya is defined as the genesis, let us say, the breeding ground for all the other kleshas, which are discussed later. Asmita, Raga, Dvesha and Abhinivesha. These are the four kleshas that come after avidya. Our wrong sense of our own identity, and then our extreme infatuation to certain things, and its opposite, our aversion to certain things, and again this lingering fear of our own disappearance or extinction. The fear of death I mentioned last time, which expresses itself in the feeling that we are eternal, so we cling to our own identity because we don't know what we really are. So that's the idea behind. So now all these are different kleshas which emerge in avidya. So what are they? So they are explained. Sometimes they are dormant. Some of these are dormant. It's called prasupta or pralina, it is called. Now in certain highly advanced spiritual persons, which Yoga Sutra refers to, we'll refer later on, those who are highly advanced spiritual persons, in their minds, this avidya and all the kleshas that we are going to discuss in future, they are all in a dormant condition. I mean, they can never really express themselves. Raga and Dvesha, the seeds of these tendencies may be there, but they never express. Because through long yogic practices, spiritual disciplines, they completely transcended them. So it's just like seeds that are burned. It's as good as a piece of stone because it cannot germinate, it cannot grow into a plant. So it no more it cannot be called seed. It's called dagdha bija. Dagdha means burned, bija means seed. So that is how it is found among the most advanced spiritual seekers. There is a Sanskrit sloga here that again is mentioned in the commentators' works. Prasuptas tattvalinanam tanuvastha yoginam vichinno udara rupascha klesha visheshankinam. So one category is called prasupta, means these tendencies are sleeping, they are dormant, they are as good as ineffective, non-functional. Through long years of different life cycles of continued yoga practice, all the raga, dvesha, extreme likes and dislikes and fear and anger and anxiety and worry, happiness and unhappiness, all these are completely dormant. They can never come to the surface of the mind. Again, I don't want to compare this to consciousness, unconscious, conscious, unconscious equations of modern psychology. That may not be fully accurate. So, but let's say because yoga propounds its own unique psychology. So, which at least according to me is more profound than anything that modern psychology can conceive of. So one is prasupta, then tattvalinanam, that's the meaning. Tanuvastha yoginam. What about the yoga? What about those who have practiced a lot of yoga but not reached this higher transcendental level? For them, they become very subtle, so abstract that they are as good as non-functional. And then vichinna actually means, suppose a person has got a lot of aversion towards something, but it is subdued by some other contrary thought currents. For example, when a person is very joyous, is enjoying a great music or something, then all his other mental aberrations like extreme dislike or bitterness, all this will be in a subdued state. It's an example of vichinna. Vichinna actually means, something that is completely subdued, is completely overpowered by a counter vrittis, by a counter samskara, by an opposite samskaras. So this is also one way. This frequently happens. When we are enjoying a great, let's say, music, wonderful music, people frequently we may forget all bitterness or problems and other things. It happens. We're enjoying something that takes us to a higher transcendental level. Then we may forget, at least for the time being, all our problems. So one set of vrittis are completely overpowered, subdued by a strong vritti. What is that? You are enjoying the music. It's an example of how these mental tendencies function. That is vichinna. That udara meant udaranam. Udarana is what happens, when our mind has certain tendencies, impressions gathered at the deeper layers of our mental system, which are really looking for an expression. If there is an external situation, a condition which is conducive for their manifestation, then immediately that tendency will manifest. I gave this example when I was discussing Bhagavad Gita. Those who have done a lot of spiritual practices in their past lives, done great things, done a lot of meditation, in any traditional religion, those who have really thought of something beyond this body-mind complex. That's what we are going to discuss in the coming sutras. Anyone who can think of himself or herself as other than this physical body and body-mind complex. That is the criterion. and who has thought of something higher and transcendental. That person will express this higher tendency even after centuries, even if he takes birth in sometime in distant future, and then if that person finds some external surroundings or conditions which are conducive to spiritual practice, spiritual contemplation, immediately he will connect, and that spiritual life, he will continue his spiritual life. Tatradam buddhi samyogam labhade paurodekikam yatateja tato bhuya samsiddhu kuridantana. That's what Lord Krishna says in the 6th chapter. So what happens, this could happen even after several life cycles, because these tendencies are already there in the mental system. When there is an appropriate surrounding or external situation that emerges around us, it will connect. And unfortunately, it is also true, in fact much more true for negative tendencies. That is also true. Yoga Sutra will tell you, commentators will make an observation that negative tendencies have a greater possibility of expression. There is something in it. In fact, it is this psychological possibility that could be at the root of the very concept of the devil in some of the Abrahamic religious traditions, because we want an explanation for something in our mind which we cannot really find an explanation from a purely scriptural or psychological angle. So we want to catch hold of somebody who is responsible for all this. And then if that will prompt us to do prayer and meditation, it really works. You know why? Because if you are afraid of the devil, and if we go to temple or church and does a lot of prayer and meditation, maybe the devil may be totally non-existent. Poor man, there is no such thing in the world. But your spiritual practices will produce spiritual energy, and that will certainly benefit us in spiritual life. So these are the 4 types of kleshas. How kleshas function? One is prasupta, means dormant. They remain in a dormant condition. That is among the tattva linanam. That is one view that normally you find in Vijnana Bhikshu, and some of the commentators will give some additional idea. The Patanjali, we don't know whether Patanjali really meant that, but that is a very logical explanation. Then tadavasthacha yoginam. Those who have done a lot of meditation, spiritual practice, yoga training, then you know what happens? These negative tendencies, these kleshas, raga, dvesha, etc., they will become so subtle, attenuated, so that they will not express, they will become as good as subdued. That's the idea. It's just like, let's say, another example is a cobra, a poisonous cobra, and the sarpa, the same cobra or a snake which is burned in a fire, let us say an accidental fire, and it may be lying on the floor. It is not real poisonous, not real snake. It can't do any harm to anybody, but still it may have the shape of a snake. A seed may look like a seed, but it is burnt and cooked like that. That is the state of these negative tendencies in the mental system of a yogi. Then vichinna means overpowered, subdued by a contrary tendency, an opposite tendency. Udarana means which expansion. These tendencies are there. They are not subdued. They are looking for expression. If there is a tempting situation emerging from external conditions, suddenly this tendency may express. A person who have a good tendency may express that tendency. A person who has a bad tendency, he also will express it. That's the idea behind. So now, what is avidya? Avidya is nothing but kshetra, means the breeding ground, the source of origin of all the uttaresham, means the other kleshas which are mentioned after avidya. That means asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. All these, they take birth, they have their origin in this avidya. So that is the idea behind. So sometimes you find a Yoga Sutras uses certain words like klesha bijas. Klesha bijas. Bija means seed. Seeds of klesha samskaras. What are klesha samskaras? Klesha samskaras are those samskaras, those tendencies which may not express in this life, but can and will express sometime in our future life cycles. So that is an important point, remember. Somebody sometime may ask this question. I have been asked this question frequently. Does it mean that we should be always watch our mind, what our mind is thinking? You go crazy. You can't do that. You cannot watch your mind and let me see what my mind is thinking now. I should force my mind to something good and creative and constructive. We can't do that. What we can do, we can take up some higher ideal as our life goal. It could be anything. If we cannot pray and meditate, we should do something that's good, that is proper, that will be good for our life and also good for others also. Something creative and constructive at a physical level, intellectual level, mental level. If we take up, then what happens, our mind and mental energies of this chittam, the mental world, will move in one direction, and that will generate a lot of productive, constructive, creative tendencies. So that is how human personality expresses itself according to the fourth sutra. It is a very, very important sutra. And here I just want to refer to one great commentator, as again his name is Vijnana Bhikshu, who wrote this well-known book, Yoga Vartika, it is called. So he has something very profound to say, Vijnana Bhikshu. Atra vidya kshetram prasava bhumihi uttaresham asmita dinam. Prasava bhumi means the place where they are born, the womb of the klesha samskaras. That is avidya. So then he says, tatra ka prasuptihi chetasi shaktimatra pradhishthanam bija bhavopagama tasya prabodha alambane samukhi bhava. So what is this? What is this prasupti state, the dormant state according to Vajaspati? It is the presence in our mental system of other kleshas like asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, etc. in the form of a seed. But again, the seed is not going to fertilize. The seed has lost its ability and power to create problems. But it is there. Now, what happens in the coming verses, Vijnana Bhikshu makes a statement, when we are aware of the possibility of these tendencies in our mind, then they will not express it. In his explanation of Udara, the fourth category, I mean, when we are not fully alert, when we are not fully aware of the problems that our own mind can drag us into, there are situations when our mind can land us in trouble. You sit quiet for some time, you imagine, and sometimes the mind tendencies and impressions, imaginations may go to very, very undesirable areas of imagination. And that can lead a person into corresponding undesirable actions. And those actions can land us in trouble. That is the example of what happens when a person is not alert, is not aware of his own mind and its tendencies. So that is the example of udara, means where you're completely off guard. The total contrast to prasupta. Prasupta state is characteristic of a highly advanced yogi, where the kleshas are completely dormant, non-functional. Udara state, the fourth category, is an example of what happens when we do not try to practice any self-restraint. We don't care for any kind of self-control. So yoga can be roughly, broadly defined as an effort to put ourselves in some kind of self-restraint or self-control, balance. That in that sense, when we totally listen to our senses, when we totally are at the beck and call, completely controlled by the passions of our own senses, then what happens, our mind becomes so weak, we become so weak that we become overpowered, we become tempted, our mind will go to undesirable channels. That is the example of the fourth category, udara state. But the prasupta state, what it means? What it means is that these tendencies are completely under control. So prasankhyanavatu dagdha klesha bijasya sammukhi bhudai api alambanena asau punarasti. That means because of your spiritual practice, you get prasankhyana. Because of your proper understanding, what happens? In a person in whom this awareness has arisen, the seeds of kleshas, this samskara, klesha samskaras are completely burned. And then what happens, they don't awaken. Even when we are face to face with tempting situations, these negative tendencies will not drag us into undesirable channels. That's what happens to a person in whom these tendencies are completely transcended and so become dormant. So this is an example. Now we'll go to the next sutra, that is so next sutra is Anitya Ashuji Dukkha Anatmasu Nitya Shuji Sukha Atmakhyadihi Avidya. It's another very important explanation of what avidya is, how it functions, how it operates in our life, and how it influences our thoughts and ideas and behavior patterns. So what happens, So one important aspect that Yoga Sutra and commentators also emphasize is that every spiritual seeker should be able to understand how impure our own body is. It's very, very important principle. It doesn't mean that we should have contempt for our body or that we should neglect. Everyone should do proper exercise, should have balanced diet, nutritious food. Everything is important. We should take care of our body, hygiene. It's all mask and gloves, as you mentioned. It's part of our preservation of health and bodily health. But at the same time, that should not make us ignorant of the fact that body is at the best, the most suitable and the most wonderful instrument for doing and achieving something much higher and much greater. Then then the usefulness, the dignity and the relevance of the body itself becomes higher. In fact, that's what I explained in the light of that important verse, sloka from Kalidasa. It comes in the Kumara Sambhava. That is Api kriyartham sulabham samit kusum jalani visnana vidhikshamanite api swashaktya tapasi pravartase sharira madhyam khalu dharma sadhanam. Though it comes in a different context where Shiva is testing his devotee, but there is an important message, that is sharira madhyam khalu dharma sadhanam. This body is the most wonderful instrument in our hands. These senses are also most wonderful instruments, very useful tools in our hands for us to do great things, to think of great things. Mind and intellect are wonderful gifts from God. A healthy body is also a need, a necessity, and a gift from God. But then one should always think of something higher than body. Then body is put to the best use. It is not meant for sensual enjoyment alone. So yoga is not a life-negating, a world-negating system of philosophy. Surprisingly, you find among the Hinayana Buddhists and also Mahayana Buddhists, apart from traditional Hindu ascetics, even among the Jains, who are well known for extreme ascetic practices, who carry this physical asceticism to an extreme level. Some of these ideas have influenced the later commentators and their views. So they have expressed certain ideas which are only meant to teach us to look upon body just as an instrument, a useful, wonderful instrument, not as an end in itself, not as the only thing that to be concerned about, to be cared for. We should also care for something higher than our body. Our personality is something much higher than what our body presents. If you judge a person by physical body alone, what do you think of a great man like Lincoln or Gandhi? Classic examples. They have influenced, they have inspired great men and women, they have inspired nations and cultures and civilizations, you find. Great men and women. So, their ideas, the teachings and what they taught and what they did continue to inspire people all over the world. So there is a verse, I was trying to make you ready for this important verse which I am going to discuss right now. It's quoted by Vijnana Bhikshu in Yoga Bhashya Vartikam. It is a very profound message. Anyway, the verse is this: Sthana Bijat Upashtambhat Nishinda Nidhanadabi Kaya Matheya Saujatvat Pandidahi Ashuchim Viduhu. The conclusion itself is sufficiently shocking. The great scholars and saints have come to one verdict: this body is dirty. Essentially dirty. So I have prepared, you should not get shocked, that's why I prepared the ground for this statement. One is Thanat. Where does it come from? You don't like to sit in a place where it is coming from, something that closely resembles the place where it is coming from. Anyway, so Vijnana Bhikshu has already quoted and explained, so I don't want to repeat what he says. So sthanam, where it comes from, bijam, the biological genetic origin. Upashtambham, and again everything is made of food, what you eat and what you drink. So all the physical things, the bone, the marrow, the blood and things that you cannot avoid washing your hands if you touch, So that's what he says, Upashtambha. Nishyanda means, it said that the body has got 9 openings. Anything that comes out of the 9 openings, you have to wash your hands. So it's called Upashtambha. Nishyantam means it's called Navadwaras. 9 openings of the body. Anything that comes out of these 9 openings, you should wash your hands. Nithanam, and again, whatever you do, you eat healthy food, do exercise, still, maximum, Ramanuja lived for 120 years, Buddha for 80 years, Shankara for 32 years, now Christ for 30 years perhaps. Now the point is, Vivekananda from 1863 to 1902, that is 39 years. Sri Ramakrishna also just about 50 years nearly. So, all these great men, whether Buddha or Christ or Sri Ramakrishna, anyone you take, so I don't think that Ramanuja went to gymnasium every day to preserve his body. He lived for 120 years, it is said. Still, he has to die. This body has to be dispensed with at some point in future. That is what is meant by here, but meant by this particular word. That is Nishyantam. You have to get rid of it at some point. And then Adheya Saujatvam. You go on washing, taking bath, beautifying, still essentially it is not either beautiful or clean. Because again, the beauty is only for the skin that covers what it covers. That's all. That's the meaning of the verse that Vijnana Bhikshu quotes. And therefore, this body as such is great and good. We should remember, Kalidasa says, Mukhyam Sadhanam. It is the most interesting, important, relevant, useful instrument for a higher purpose. That's the idea. It has a positive importance and relevance. But as such, it is nothing more than a great, wonderful instrument. So that is the idea behind here. So it is also Anitya. Anitya in the sense, it doesn't last long. It has a beginning, it has an end. That's the idea behind. So Asuchi. And the point, in spite of all that, we have a tendency to look upon what is impermanent as permanent. And we have a tendency to be deluded into thinking that this body can be kept clean and healthy and eternal. It's not going to happen. So that is why avidya is nothing but mistaking the impermanent as the permanent, the non-eternal, mistaking the non-eternal for the eternal, mistaking the impure for the pure, and mistaking what is actually painful. It is sukha, so that is a nitya, shuchi, sukha, atmakhyadi, avidya means. So what it mean? Anitya, asuchi, dukkha, anatmasu, nitya, shuchi, sukha, atmakhyadi. So what is actually dukkha, we mistake as sukha. And what is actually anatma, the non-atman, the non-self, the non-atman, we mistake as atman. What does it mean? Atman is something that we consider to be the highest, the most sublime, the eternal, the transcendental, the embodiment of purity, the embodiment of everything that is positive and transcendental, sublime. And a normal person who may not take to anything higher in life, such a person is not, in other words, he is not a yogi or he is not a spiritual seeker. A spiritual seeker can be, in a broad sense, can be called a yogi. Now, such a person, what happens? He looks upon this body and the senses as the eternal, as the embodiment of purity, as the source of all joy, and as the eternal reality. This is how avidya functions. It's a functional definition of avidya. The first one is psychological definition. It is a functional definition of avidya. So, this is the definition that you find here. If you have got, I think, those of you who may have heard this particular sloka that I quoted, which where the particular one that I mentioned, that is sthanad bijad upashtambad nishyandad nidhanadavi kaya matheye shaujatvat pandidahi ashuchim viduh, means there are 6 causes, 6 ways of expressing our natural instinctive ignorance or our lack of awareness of the reality. How they express in our daily life, that is mentioned here. That is, wise people consider this body as impure, etc., as the source of all problems, etc. Here we should understand, from the higher perspective, this body is certainly a wonderful instrument, but still spiritual life begins when we look for something higher than what we experience with our senses and mind. That is true in Vedanta, Yoga, Buddhism, everywhere. When we look for something higher than what we see with our eyes and what we hear with our ears, what we understand at the empirical level, when we look for something higher, that is the beginning of human evolution beyond the biological one. That's the idea behind. That's what happened to Buddha when he left his palace and went to Bodh Gaya and sat under the tree and became Buddha. That's what happened to Christ. That's what happened to every great spiritual person, any tradition. I mean, they just outgrow their infatuation with the empirical, with the sensory world. So that is the implication of this particular sloka. Now we'll go to the 6th sutra. I think we have time. The 6th sutra is very important. Drik darshana shaktyoho ekatmada iva asmida. This is meaning. What is asmida? Egoity is explained here. So it is some kind of a wrong or false identity or identification. I mean, it is nothing but the apparent identity of the power of the seer and the power of seeing. In other words, these are certain words to be understood properly. Drik. Drik means a seer, the experiencer, the perceiver, the witness, the subject, or can be called Drik. In Vedanta, Drashta or Drik is Atman. And if you read Vivekananda's exposition of Yoga Sutras, he links yoga with Vedanta. In the literature of Patanjali system, you find here Drik or Drashta stands for Purusha, which is essentially conscious, which is consciousness itself. Now, this Purusha, what happens? This is our true nature. We are essentially consciousness itself. What happens, we identify ourselves with what we see and experience in the external world, and also in our own mental system. So, for example, when we say, I'm the mind, I'm thinking, I'm happy, I'm unhappy, I love this person, I hate this person, I don't like this, or I like this, all this. These are examples of this false identification indicated in this sutra. So you find one word is the Iva. Iva means as if, as it were. That is the meaning of the word. which implies that this identification is really false. It is actually unreal. It is not correct. So that's the meaning here. So, how it functions, how avidya functions at a different level, that is explained here. When we forget our true identity, that is, we are the subject, we are the Atman, that we forget, and then we identify ourselves with the instruments, darshana shakti, that is instrument. It be the senses of perception, like the eyes with which we see things. When I see something, I identify myself as the seer of that. And when I hear something, I identify myself as the one who hears that. So this identification creates a lot of similar identifications and false understandings, false notions in their chain, one after another. So, instrument means the senses of perception, the senses of action, and the 5 elements and the 5 vital forces, plus our mind, intellect, and then sense of ecosystem and memory. It's called mana, buddhi, chitta, ahankara, called antakaranas, the internal organs. That's what, that they constitute the instruments through which our self within expresses itself and connects the external world. Now, if a person really understands the meaning of this sutra, then he will be able to overcome many of the problems of anxieties and worries. We frequently, what happens when we really face a problem. If we can look upon the problem as a problem, something that to be solved, something that should be addressed properly, it is okay. But when we lose our balance, when we become mentally frustrated or devastated, become too anxious and worried and concerned, then that's a problem. That's a real problem. That's a much greater problem. So if a person understands this, he will be able to explain this as a, drig darshana saktyoho ekatmada. That means we are identifying ourselves to be as the one single person going through this problem. And also, not only that, we look upon this problem as something eternal, permanent, and everlasting. So this sutra should be properly understood in the context of the earlier sutras. When we identify ourselves as this body-mind complex, then a problem we are facing at the body-mind complex level, that problem will be misconstrued or misunderstood to be as something permanent, something everlasting. And once we get stuck at this level, thinking that this problem is going to be there all the time, then we are lost. But if we can think of this unpleasant situation as something that comes and goes, which is part of the empirical experience, which is not eternal, and my losing balance is just the result of this, the drig darshana shaktyoga ekatmada, this false identification, then we will be able to detach ourselves from this problem. So anyway, we will discuss this subject again in the coming session. Now we can have interaction for the next, I think, nearly half an hour. Yeah, thank you.
Hari Om Swamiji.
Yeah.
Swamiji, close to the beginning of the class, you said when you're defining avidya in various different ways, one of the definitions you gave was avidya is our natural state where we are not aware of our true identity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Once we are aware of our identity, won't this identity disappear into pure consciousness? Would there no longer exist a separate identity? So does this mean everything is avidya? And if everything is avidya, then is there some way for someone to experience this vidya as they are making progress towards actual spiritual growth?
Avidya is something that we eventually realize to be unreal when we transcend it. Avidya is not an entity. It is a state of our being unaware of our true nature. So once we become aware of our true nature, then the very question of the nature of avidya, going beyond avidya, doesn't appear at all. The example, suppose you mistake a rope for a snake, and when you bring light, then you realize it is not a snake but a rope. Then you don't really worry about why did I misunderstand? Why did I mistake the rope for a snake? That question will never arise because you have understood the real thing for what it is. Similarly, a correct understanding of avidya is this. It is something that really never exists. But the fact that it doesn't exist is clear to you only when you go beyond it. So, any discussion of avidya is totally irrelevant, because Shankaracharya himself said, avidya as Maya is beyond definition. It is Mahanbhuta Anirvachaniya Rupa. It cannot be defined, it should be explained. There are many things in the world that we cannot really put in words. So, even if you write a big volume on this subject, that book and all the words you have used will be only an approximation, and especially something which is essentially based on our experience, based on the spiritual evolution. So, a discussion of avidya, it happens in many scriptures, that fundamentally it is defined as something beyond words, beyond explanation, but you understand that it really doesn't exist only when you go beyond it. So now, I shall come to complete. Now the point is, in our practical life, we may ask this question. So how do I confront this problem? We may ask the question. So as we step into spiritual life and do any kind of spiritual practice, then our mind begins to evolve and our mind begins to move. Then you find from that level, when you think of avidya or God or whatever, any spiritual subject, we will change. We will get a much more correct understanding of it. That's why some of these deeper questions, which are defined as indescribable, anirvachaniya, can be properly understood only when we step into spiritual life. That's the idea behind. This is an important point. In fact, this whole idea you find in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there's a big discussion. Gargi Brahmanam is called. Yajnavalkya and Gargi, big debates. And the Gargi at one point goes on asking questions. Then Yajnavalkya replied, Gargi, be careful, your head will fall off. You find that. In fact, that is an English translation. That is true. You know what it means? Now look here. From this step onwards, you are actually asking a question about which you will not understand unless you go beyond your present level of consciousness awareness. That's the meaning of your head will fall off. So many people who don't study Vedanta in a very traditional circles with the bhashyas and tikas, frequently they are, what is the mean? The old man is cursing the lady. It's not a curse. So you find in the bhashya, say, beyond a particular limit, you find spiritual ideas, even yoga ideas can be understood only at the experience level. So once we in our own life, we sometimes in our own empirical life, your professional life, your academic life, there are many questions that we are prone to asking ourselves, and we will look for answers in different books. After some time, you find when you ascend to the next stage of your awareness, these questions cease to be questions. Questions are not answered. These questions are no longer questions. So you will be looking back, how I do ask those questions in those days. You will ask. So like that, avidya is something that becomes clear to us when we step into spiritual life. Yeah.
Thank you, Swamiji. So I have a very small related question.
Yeah, please, most welcome.
So you just said avidya is basically an understanding. It is more. It is not really a certain thing, but it is. It is a state where once you cross it, once you get to the reality, you understand that what you had previously experienced was unreal. Right. So now, is this kind of a state where one can regress back? Like, say, I see a snake. I see a rope. I think it is a snake. I turn the light on. Now I realize it is a rope. Then I turn the light off, I go to another room, I come back after a while, I again see the rope and I again think it is a snake.
It doesn't happen because previously you have understood that. But the point is, now this analogy is apt, but when you use this analogy and use it to expound a spiritual experience, you should know there is a detailed description of this. What is the state of a Jivan Mukta? A person who has achieved, who has understood the reality, who has spiritual enlightenment. Does he eat food? He lives in this world like any of us. That's true. Yeah, but the point is, even in the midst of all these daily activities and duties and responsibilities, he will always have this awareness of the non-eternal nature of all these things. He will always have this. He doesn't keep this awareness all the time. Then you can't have anything in this world. You can't do anything. But when there is a situation which normally can create problem, can worry, can give a lot of concern to ordinary people, this Jivan Mukta, he is not worried. So that is the only time when you can distinguish a spiritual person from a non-spiritual person. Is a spiritual person, Vedanta and Yoga, is not to be understood somebody who shows a lot of external rituals or anything. His true spirituality is expressed when we observe how he responds to certain situations, which normally can be shattering, can be devastating to a normal person. Look at a man like Gandhi, who wrote this Anasakti Yoga. Apparently he was a typical conservative Hindu, he was. But he very rarely visited temples, practically never had any rituals performed in his name. Even when he on one occasion fought for the temple entry for the downtrodden classes in South India, he did that. He never entered the temple, but he is considered to be a great spiritual man. How do you know? Look at the way he died. He was not frightened, he was not scared, he was not worried, uttering the name of Ram, which he was perhaps uttering silently in his mind. Now, I am giving an extreme example of a man who lived like a politician, but he was a saint all through his life. You may or may not like Gandhism, that's a different matter. But you are one of the greatest human beings the world has ever seen. Gandhi, he inspired people. So how do you define his religion? His religion or his spirituality defy the normal definitions and interpretations of religion and spirituality in any tradition. It's a classic example. True Buddha also, who did not believe he was an agnostic, he did not believe in a creator God as we understand normally. So you find they transcended avidya, but could Gandhi was, all the time he was busy creating headache with the British colonizers. He's a man in the world politician, but he was a saint. There are wonderful examples to that. So in actual practice, you can test a person based on how he responds to situations that normally will devastate a normal human being. That's the difference.
Thank you so much, Swami.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. This is similar to the avidya only. It is related to avidya, but I'm sure the answer you already answered the question. But I want to know how to answer it properly if somebody asks this.
Yeah.
See, I was asked a question in Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
It's related to this. What they said is, look, Krishna, if he is a realized person, he would not have seen anything other than Krishna because he would have only seen Brahman.
Yeah.
That means he would be one with Nirguna Brahman and he wouldn't have seen even Arjuna, he would talk to Arjuna. How do you explain that Krishna talked to Arjuna? Because he doesn't see Arjuna because all he sees is only one Brahman. He cannot talk to anybody.
No,
I thought you have to reduce the state of Krishna to lower. You please answer.
I can give the example not only based on Krishna but other great spiritual persons also. Say, of course, you give the example of Krishna. The same Krishna, he was a very practical man. Very practical man. Yatra yogeshwara Krishno yatra partho dhanudhara tatra si vijayo bodhidhruva nidir matir mama. The last verse of the Gita is, wherever there is Krishna, where there is Arjuna, there will be victory, there will be justice, there will be stable system and so on. Actually, Krishna, after explaining all the, Yogatraya and then the highest Advaita philosophy and so on, he says, towards the end of the 18th chapter, he says, never teach this, what I taught you, to those who don't have tapasya, who don't have the tendency to do the humility to do seva, and who actually criticize you from behind. So that's a very interesting statement that's come Krishna. So he was a very practical man. The highest spiritual person who is a Brahmajnani, who have reached the highest spiritual experience. That is Brahma Satyam Jagad Mithya at the philosophical level, Brahma Satyam Jagad Satyam at the spiritual experience level. Even such a person, when he works in this world, he will be working like a normal person. The only difference is he will be doing his work, and if he doesn't succeed, he won't be shocked, he won't be disappointed. If he succeeds, he won't be overjoyed. So the stability of mind, the stable equilibrium of his mind, that's what you find in a Brahmajnani. In fact, even in the case of Mahatma Gandhi also, coming back to subject, one of the prominent disciples of Sri Ramakrishna himself once gave a statement. He is knocking at the doors of Brahman. It means he's like a yogi. To Swami Turiyananda, who came to San Francisco, with the founder of the Shanti Ashrama, he observed Gandhi. He is like a true yogi. So you find that stability of mind, the equanimity, the equilibrium of the mind. That's what really distinguishes Sthita Prajna, Sthita Prajna is just the person whose Prajna is Sthita. His mind, his mental system is so established in equanimity and equilibrium. That is the criterion by which you can judge a person. Yeah.
Swamiji, Namaskaram.
Yeah.
I have a question on kleshas. Yeah. You mentioned for realized souls that they, their kleshas are burnt and it doesn't really show up.
Yeah.
But for people like us, where we have many kleshas and obviously some of them are evident in this birth. There are many that we don't know that exist. How to identify the kleshas that need to be taken care of at this stage, and then how to identify them is the first question, and then also how do you overcome those? What do you do to overcome those? Would be the second question.
These kleshas, we need not try to identify them. But of course, one writer, see, suppose you feel, let's say some people are affected by extreme, I'm giving some examples, extreme greed, for example, love for money. Then you think of the problems that too much of wealth can bring to persons, the problems that the greedy people have to face. So that's one way of using a mechanism is called in the Yoga Sutra, Pratipaksha Bhavana, means the vichinna. Vichinna means one negative tendency can be subdued, it could be overpowered with the help of a positive tendency. That is the meaning of vichinna. So all the kleshas can be prasupta, it can be tanu, it can be vichinna, it can be udara. So one can subdue a negative tendency with the help of a positive tendency. But in practical life, we need not go about dictating or looking for our kleshas. If we spend our time and energy in doing good things and connecting with spiritual ideas, by listening, by reading, by associating with people whose association can strengthen and reinforce our own spiritual tendencies, that's enough. Then you find these kleshas gradually become weaker and weaker. You can very easily see, you can find children, at least in conservative homes, maybe not now, but in the early days, parents used to be very watchful about how, when they brought up children, they would say children should associate with only persons whose association will be a blessing, be help to them. Maybe not now, of course, it is against egalitarian culture, but there is a tendency, there is an interesting even how we should try to make great ideas, positive ideas, spiritual ideas accessible to children. How children should be taught some of these great ideas, because those ideas will generate good tendencies in their mental system, and that will help them to grow up to be ideal citizens. So teachings of great religious traditions, even not necessarily religious traditions, you create any great teachings from any person in any even non-religious traditions are grand examples out there who are not necessarily religious. So these are great and useful ways of planting the seeds of good tendencies, good impressions, good samskaras in the minds of children. Then you find whatever kleshas, whatever negative samskaras they have, those samskaras will be subdued, will be weakened, and that helps us to grow to be ideal citizens. That in general.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Saugata. Your turn.
Yeah.
Pranam Swamiji.
Yeah.
So I have my understanding is like this.
Yeah.
I mean with Thakur, when we say Ashmita, Thakur in Thakur's way, it is Kacha Ami.
Yeah.
And we say Purusha, it is Paka Ami.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. This is a very practical, simple way of explaining to those who gathered around Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna says, Kachami means that is not mature, immature. So Sri Ramakrishna says, of course, there, Sri Ramakrishna means means a sense of pride or identity. Aham bhava means. If a person is very proud and very confident of his abilities and what he is, he can put all this at good service. So if you want to be, if you are very proud, then you try to be proud of doing good things and eventually to be proud of being a devotee of God. In Sri Ramakrishna's terms, you be a servant of God. So that is also a kind of pride, a kind of egoism. But that egoism will eventually take you beyond egoism. So all mental aberrations can be put into good service. That's the meaning of what Sri Ramakrishna said. He told Turiyanandaji. Turiyanandaji asked this question. So how to deal with this disturbing thought currents? That is the question that Turiyanandaji put to Sri Ramakrishna. The early days of his training. Then Sri Ramakrishna said, you cannot destroy it. Because Sri Ramakrishna is a vritti, it's coming samskaras. So but you can turn your mind into something creative and constructive. So actually, this asmita is also a kind of vritti. Kleshas are vrittis only, klesha vrittis. So I'm very proud. I'm proud of what I am or what I did, what I achieved. Well, then try to turn that mind with so much of pride into something creative and constructive, something spiritual orientation. So that's why Sri Rama says, if you're proud, try to be proud. I'm a servant of God. Let it be. That's okay. Because that will help you to slowly go transcend this sense of pride, go beyond pride. That's okay. Every human emotions can be put into some good service, and that will help us to transcend the body identity.
Thank you, Swami.
Yeah.
Swamiji, Pranam,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, while we say we are ignorant of our true nature, I also feel that there are subtle clues out there which makes us intuitively be aware of our true nature. For example, when we talk about who we are, we point to our heart. Or externally, people may see us changing quite a bit, but deep within, we feel that I'm the same, like I feel the same as when I was 20 years old. Are these intuitive clues to us being aware of our true nature?
Not necessarily. If this awareness, if you can retain this awareness, and this awareness helps you to do spiritual practices, then it's a proof that it is something constructive, creative, genuine. That is true. But otherwise, some flashes, some impulses need not necessarily be related to this. That's it. If with all these, if you feel at home, when we do something noble, when we try to do some spiritual practice spiritual discipline, if our mind is ready to cooperate, if we don't feel any inner conflict, that means our mind has got a surplus amount of positive vrittis, samskaras. I mean, some negative kleshas are all subdued by one overpowering ambition and desire to achieve something higher in spiritual life, in spiritual realm. That's why it comes in later in the sadhana pada itself, the parinama samskara is mentioned here. Parinama tapa samskara, that comes later. Guna visheshachas dukkhameva sarvam vivekinaha. So parinama samskara is a transforming samskara, a higher ideal, an ambition for something higher and spiritual, in spite of everything going on fine in the empirical worldly level, you have no problem, still you look for something higher. So that higher aspiration is a proof that we have a surplus of spiritual healthy samskaras in our mental system. That's the idea behind. So we can easily detect where we stand by trying to meditate, and if you don't feel any conflict, it means our samskaras perfectly are cooperating with us. Mind is in friendly terms with ourselves. That's what it means.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Swamiji, namaste.
Yeah.
Question is on Vichinna, as you are describing.
Yeah.
Many times we are, maybe there are people who are singers or we are attending these lectures. We are actually overpowering our bad tendency. But there is still Maya. So we still need to do action or service, right, Maharaj, to overcome that. Just Vichinna overpowering, will it diminish completely, or we should still have to overcome that bad vrittis? to get that.
When Patanjali mentions Vichina, there are two aspects to that. One is he gives an example of how certain kleshas function. An example of Vichina kleshas, when one klesha, one vritti is subdued, overpowered by another one, then the one which is overpowered doesn't express itself. The another aspect to is we can always try to weaken or not repression as we understand in modern psychology, because it has a destructive, a negative fallout consequence that should be understood. But here what it means, you are actually trying to take an ascent in your own mental level. So suppose a person is disturbed by too much of ambition, too much of certain things, and because he is a spiritual seeker, he is aware of it. When we turn to spiritual life, what happens? We become aware of some of these things going on in our own mind. Unless we take to spiritual life, we don't become aware of this. When you become aware of this, its power is almost weakened. This is an important point to understand. In spiritual life, when we are aware of the possibility of our own mind having some negative samskaras, and where this awareness itself will help us to weaken it. And then we can take the help of some positive samskaras to make it vichina, to subdue, to overpower the negative samskaras. It is possible. But again, it may come back. But constant attempt to subdue and overpower negative kleshas, negative samskaras will certainly help us to stay stable in positive tendencies. After all, kleshas are all function as samskaras. And samskaras come from previous life cycles. It's called karmasya. Karmasya is like a huge reservoir, huge bag, in which all the samskaras are deposited. When they are klesha samskaras, they don't necessarily express themselves in one life, but they will express in future life cycles. So they may express at any time. But once we become aware of this possibility, half the battle is won. Because then we become aware of this possibility only when we become aware of the need to go beyond, to transcend it. Our awareness of this possibility of being tempted by negative samskaras and our awareness of the need to go beyond it, they act together. Then what happens? We'll be able to take hold of something positive, some positive samskaras, to weaken negative samskaras. That this is what really happens. Even if you are able to enjoy, you are able to appreciate, you are able to feel at home in the world of spiritual ideas, because this already is a storehouse of positive samskaras in our mind. This is an interesting point in the Yoga Sutra brings out. Our mind will connect with something outside when a similar samskara is already present in our mental system. When something is happening in the external world, our mind flows towards that, moves towards that, gets trapped in that. That's because there are similar samskaras which are already deposited in our mental system. It may be coming from previous life cycles. So they connect. So similarly, if we go on increasing our positive samskaras, then our mind will naturally become stable and will be established in equilibrium. Stability and equanimity of mind. Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj. So there is one question on YouTube.
Yeah.
Last question maybe. What is tapas in simple words? Is that a cleaning process? Krishna Kumar Chokkalinga asks on YouTube.
Tapa actually means any kind of ascetic practices can be tapa. So, according to first sutra, tapaswadhyaya ishara pranidhanani kriya yoga. So, tapa can be any kind of spiritual practices. Any kind of spiritual practices that involves self-restraint and self-control and concentration. So, karma yoga is one way, bhakti yoga is one way, jnana yoga is one way. Any of these can act as tapa. Tapa, and even in the ordinary parlance, by the word tapa we mean some kind of austerity, practicing doing ascetic practices. That is also helpful, no doubt about it, because when we try to practice some self-restraint in our own daily life, some kind of a discipline without exceeding it, extreme asceticism is not recommended either in yoga or in Vedanta. But moderate ascetic practices will be certainly helpful, because that will help us to get our mind ready for higher practices in yoga. This is true of Vedanta also.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah, thank you.
Naveen, please go ahead and ask your question, maybe the last question.
Yeah.
Namaste, Maharaj. This is morning in India now. I'm calling from India. I'm talking from India.
Yeah.
Actually, I want to know, out of curiosity, I want to know the difference between this 4 yogas and this Kriya Yoga. What is Kriya Yoga?
Oh, Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is defined in the first sutra of Patanjali's Sadhana Pada. Tapaka Swadhyaya Ishara Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga. Where Patanjali is talking about stepping into yoga life. Yoga life here means spiritual life. That's meaning here. So, that Kriya Yoga is already mentioned here, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, as mentioned in the Gita. That's why many of the commentators have taken ideas from Gita also, as a Vijnana Bhikshu and others. So the point is one, then this Swadhyaya has got 2 different meanings. One is self-study, reading holy books, and with thinking of the meaning and contemplating the meaning. That is Swadhyaya. Another meaning is listening to or repetition of Omkara, Pranava. Remember, Pranava or Omkara doesn't mean that that curved letter or script that you see in front of you. Pranava here means it is Omkara, pronounced as Pluta. So, of course, in the Mandukya tradition, Akara, Ukara, Makara, 3 matras are given. So that doesn't come as an important subject relevant here right now. So if a person repeats pranava, that itself is some kind of swadhyaya. In the broader sense, we can say if you have got any sacred mantra that you consider to be very sacred, if you can chant it with great shraddha and sanctity, sense of sanctity, that can create spiritual vibrations in our mind, can create a feeling of inner tranquility and peace and contentment. That is also one important component of Kriya Yoga. So Tapa, Swadhyaya. Ishara Pranidhana has got different meanings. Many commentators like Vijnana Bhikshu as quoted from Bhagavad Gita, Yatkarodi, Dasnasi, Yajjugoshi, etc. It also can mean Prapatti, as understood in the Ramanuja Vaishnava system, Saranagati. I mean, resigning everything to God or God's will, considering ourselves to be God's servant or whatever. That is because yoga doesn't contain any direct reference to any of the monotheistic systems of Hinduism, but different commentators have explained in different ways. So what it means is, if a person can devote himself, surrender himself to God and God's will, that sincere surrender will give a spiritual orientation to all that he does and speaks and thinks. All his thoughts, words and deeds will get a spiritual orientation. It will get a spiritual direction. So this will create the necessary mental purity or the purification of samskaras for you to step into yoga life. That's the real meaning of Kriya Yoga as mentioned in the first sutra of Sadhanapada of Patanjali. That's the only meaning. Yeah.
Yes, Maharaj?
Yeah, please, most welcome. I think we have it's already 7:30. So we shall conclude now. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Rama Krishna Arpanamastu.